Hello, welcome to Clarkston Lighthouse Guidance. I am Victoria Fleming, owner and therapist at Clarkston Lighthouse Counseling. Today, I have the privilege to interview two delightful women with a story of overcoming, even in the face of tremendous odds. Welcome, Catherine Hoff Mount and Karen Hoff Lafnear. It is such a pleasure to have you here today. As we start today's show, please tell me about yourself. Catherine.
My name is Catherine Mount. I lived in Waterford for 40 years and have lived in Clarkston for the last 19 years. I'm married to my husband, who was a professional baker for 67 years. We have 2 daughters and 3 grandchildren. My firstborn grandson is Dr. Dan Edwards, who's professor of dentistry at University of Michigan and shares a practice in Ann Arbor. My second grandson is Troy Edwards, special ed teacher in California, and my granddaughter is Erica Lurs, who's on the staff at Vanderbilt University Hospital. We have 5 great grandkids, 4 boys aging in the range from 1 and a great granddaughter 18.
Wow. You were blessed. I'll tell you. What about you, Karen?
Yes, my name is Karen, and I'm married to my husband Jim, who is a retired police officer, and we have 2 children. Our daughter Jane just retired from the Clarkston schools as a special ed teacher. And then we have a son named Stephen who lives in Goodrich with his wife and 2 daughters. And the 2 daughters are in high school. They're very tall girls and terrific volleyball players. And my daughter has a daughter, and she is also a teacher in the Brandon School District as a speech pathologist. And our grandson, Alan, he's working and finishing up his education at the University of Michigan.
Wow, very full, busy lives, I would say, with your children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren as well.
Yes.
What happened that I was able to meet Catherine first was my husband and I had been out doing just a little bit of garage selling. It's one of my favorite things to do, and so he just honored me, and we stopped, and he happened to notice some information about World War II and saw some pictures with Catherine, and he started a conversation with Catherine and asked her, what is this about? And she was able to tell us that she and her sister had written a book with the help of a neighbor, Harry, is it Knitter? Is that how he says it? Knitter, okay. And it is a book that is built upon letters that were written, and we'll touch upon those letters actually in part 2 of this 2-part story. And but I just wanted to dive in as I got to meet with the 2 of you last week, and we were talking about where do you start a story that is as big. Back World War II, a lot going on. We decided to start with your mom and dad, and they're getting married. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I guess we want to go back a little bit farther than that. My mom and dad were born in Norway, raised in Norway. In fact, they grew up living next door to each other. And my dad had a great desire to come to America. But he was one of 11 children, and they all kind of had to help work and support the family.
Okay.
But he had a great desire to come to America, so his mom had a brother who was already in the States, and she wrote to him and asked if he could do something for her son. And in response, he sent a ticket to my dad. And then he was able to come to the States, and he met up with his uncle in Minnesota, where they worked on the railroads and in the mines. But over the years, he was there a few months and then decided to go to Michigan, where they had all the factories for the automobiles, and he got a job in the auto factories. But then, do you want to tell about him going back to Norway in 1927?
Okay. He went back to Norway and asked my mom to marry him. They had been together all their lives. And she, of course, agreed. My dad went back to the States. 2 years later, they were married, and he bought her wedding dress at Hudson's downtown Detroit and brought it home to my mom.
I think that's so neat that he
Yeah.
had, so before he went back to Norway, had he bought the dress, or was it during that 2-year period
Yeah.
before?
2-year period.
Okay, so a dress from Hudson's in Detroit.
Yeah.
Yes.
So then they came back together in 1930, and together with their friends, they built a house from the Sears home kids. And they lived there. Karen and I were born there. I'm not sure how long they lived there, but when the Depression hit, it got really hard for them. And they couldn't make the payments on their house, but the bank let them stay for a year free because everybody was in the same boat. And then they decided they should go back to Norway, where all their family was. So it was decided that Karen and I and my mom should go ahead. My dad wanted to make sure that we would adjust to the new country and the language.
Okay, before we move on, I just want to hit, because there's some very important things there. One, love the fact that they built their own home with a Sears kit.
The house is still there.
And it's, and you said that was Auburn Heights, that is now Auburn Hills.
Yeah.
Okay, so the house is still there, but when the Depression hit, just like so many people, there were no jobs, there was no money to pay the mortgage. You said that the bank was gracious and said, you know, everyone's in the same boat, let's go ahead and let you stay for a year.
Right.
But then the decision was made. I would say a very hard decision was made where Mom and Dad sat down and said, we need to leave Michigan and we need to go back to Norway, where the family is. And so let's pick up from there. So the decision is made to send the two of you and your mom ahead to Norway to prepare. And now what?
Yes, well, that was in 1939, and we all set sail on one of the big ships. It was called MS Oslofjord. And when we arrived in Norway, we received many hugs from all the family that we had there. And my mom was able to find a small apartment. And her sister, Ingrid, also traveled with us from the States to Norway. So her sister lived with us, and also my mom's dad, Johan. So we were all in this small apartment. I think we only had like one bedroom, and we had to share that. And Dussi, that's my sister's nickname. Nobody calls her Catherine. We all call her Dussi. So she was able to start school, and I kind of stayed home with my mom because I was 3 years younger than she is.
Okay, so I do want to interject. So you were 3 when you got on this ship, and you were 7 at the time. Okay, so very young, headed over on this big adventure.
Right.
So you'd gotten there, your mother had found a job, your aunt, I believe, had also found a job. I
Yeah.
believe your grandfather, was he also living in the apartment?
Yes, he lived with
you?
us.
So it was the 5 of you? Okay.
So Grandpa had the one bedroom that was available. The rest of us shared bed. We had beds in the other room set up that looked like furniture for the most part.
So I am assuming you're little English-speaking girls moving to Norway, where the language is Norwegian, correct?
Yes.
So what was that like? I mean, one, what was the boat trip like? Because we're talking a large ship, a long trip.
Yeah. It was very crowded because everybody was wanting to get out of the country because it was in such disaster.
With the Depression.
No, not, that's coming back. You're getting a
that's
little ahead of
coming
your
back.
story.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
right.
So, but the ship going,
the ship going
still, okay.
was fine, and the weather was fairly good, you know, and we arrived in Norway and were greeted by all the family.
Okay. And then you did get there, and did you learn the language fairly quickly?
You know, kids pick it up very quickly. We did learn the language, and we got used to some of the food we hadn't had in a while. And but it was hard on everybody, and it turned out to be a 6-year separation from my dad. And the next few years were really tough on all of us, especially my mom, because she felt kind of alone, and there were times she didn't have enough food for her girls.
Okay.
And at one time, I mean, there was 5 of us living there, and we had like 1 loaf of bread for the week, and the bread was made with sawdust because there was nothing else available.
Okay, so I want to back up just a little bit. So we have a 3, a 7-year-old, a mom, and an aunt traveling on a ship across to Norway. You get to Norway, settle into a small apartment, and are finding, your mom and aunt are finding jobs, and you're learning the language, you're adjusting to a new school, and Dad is supposed to come. And Dad
Yes.
had some business to take care of. Why the 6-year separation? What happened that your dad was not able to join you?
In 1939, the war broke out, and as of that time, as time went on, there was no mail allowed in or out. At first, they were allowed to write to each other, but that stopped when U.S. got involved with Japan. Pearl Harbor was bombed, so nobody could get in and nobody could get out of Norway, and there was no letters to correspond. They were able to write to each other a little bit in 1940, but after that it was mostly Red Cross letters, 25 words or less, and sometimes that would take a year to get there.
So the plan had been for your father to join you once he got some loose ends tied up.
Yep.
And then the war happened.
Shortly after we got to Norway.
And I believe you said 400,000 German troops
Yeah.
moved into Norway.
Well, they did occupy Norway, and eventually it ended up, there was over 400,000 Germans took over the country in Norway. And they would come in, and we had no radios. They would take our radios. They didn't want you to know what was going on in the world. And then, of course, my dad, he was able to hear what was going on, but yet he couldn't keep in touch with us, and he was afraid he was never going to see his family again.
Which is why, Catherine, what you were saying about the letters and the fact that the letters became intermittent at best, and then there actually became was it a 5-year span that your mom and dad really were not able to communicate with each other at all, or was it 4 or 5?
4 years.
Okay, 4
years.
years, okay.
Yeah. But of course, the Germans opened all the letters that they were able to send in the beginning, you know, before they would let them come on.
So how did your mom cope?
Well,
Did she cope well? Was she?
she did a good job of protecting us about all the bad things that were going on, for the most part. And when it got really bad, Karen and I were separated from our mom and sent into the country to get away from some of the bombings and what was going on.
Now, if I recall correctly, Catherine, you ended up being sent away to a home not so exciting.
Right.
What was it about it that you didn't like?
Well, it was an older couple who never opened their blinds, and it was a dark, dreary house. And I was missing my mom so much
Absolutely.
that they finally took me out of there.
So the goal was move children from the city that was at higher risk and shift them to the country.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I do believe, Karen, you on the other hand ended up really having kind of a positive experience. Yes, you were separated from family, but you ended up where?
Yes, I did. I ended up on a farm, and the people there were very nice. And I even was able to go to school there for a little while. So I stayed for quite a while Dossie went back to town.
Okay. Where you've been returned to school also, right?
Yeah,
Catherine did,
yeah, we did for the time being.
Time being,
Yeah.
Okay.
So-
So what would you say when you look back on that time? Because it's very definitely war through the eyes of a child. What were the things that you remember that struck you at that time? Because it sounds like your family did a really nice job of sheltering you and keeping life as normal as possible, but war touches people's lives. What were some events that touched your life?
Well, there were several times when the air raid sirens would sound, and we had to get to a bomb shelter as quickly as possible. And when we got to the bomb shelter, they would have signs up, and there was one sign that it just says to be still and keep up your spirits. You could use a flashlight, but no oil lamps. and no smoking was allowed, and to make sure you stayed in the bomb shelter until you were given the all clear. So this happened quite often, and there was one time when a man's clothes was on fire, and he came into the bomb shelter, and he was just kind of screaming his house had been bombed. So things like that happen, quite often. But then in 1942, the Germans started to build a submarine base or a U-boat base, and it was only like 125 meters from the school that we attended. But they made a lot of the Norwegians, they were forced to work on the base, and they also had a lot of Russian prisoners of war. And those prisoners were treated very badly. They would work until they just dropped, and they would just cover them up with cement.
You could see a lot of that from our school because it was so close.
So by then we're looking at, you're only probably, what, 9, maybe 10? Yeah. And that would have made you 5? So that's a big thing to see, and to see a man on fire come in. And how did the adults respond? What did they do to keep the kids calm?
Well, of course, the men in there, they took off their jackets to try to crush the flames on the man, so he was able to calm down.
A lot of screaming going on and crying, but
now, I know that the building of the submarine station had a very big impact, because we had talked about the fact that bombs then could be closely aimed but not specifically aimed. What ended up happening, where was the submarine factory being set up, or the submarine station being set up? It was close to what?
Close to our school. Our school was here, and then there was a road, and the water was there, and this is where the submarine base was built.
Okay.
And it was built, just tons and tons of cement. It was very solid. Some of the bombs just bounced off of it. It was never destroyed. In fact, it's still there today.
Wow.
Yeah. So
very solid structures. So then the British are trying to assault the, and what ended up happening?
It was in 1944, it was like a black cloud came over the city. There were so many planes, and over 200 bombs were dropped. Our school was cut right in half. There were a total of 193 people killed that day, 61 kids from the school, mostly boys, because the school was cut right in half. There was one girl who was in another section of the school.
Okay.
And it was a terrible, terrible day. Everybody was running, and when we came out of the bomb shelter, Karen, in fact, was on her way to school, and I was at a dentist office, so my mom ran and got both of us to a bomb shelter. And when we walked out, everything was on fire. Water was shooting everywhere from broken water mains, and it was just a really bad time.
Oh, that had to have been terrifying.
A lot of our friends were killed,
So, and you said 61 students were killed that day. I can't even imagine the grief that would have been going on in that community. Did the community have a sense of being in this together and really working and pressing through together? What was it like to live in that community?
Oh, we all got together, and there were so many children that were killed. They didn't have enough, caskets, so they were just like pine boxes that they were put in, and we just had like mass funerals for them.
Oh, that had to have been so hard. And your dad, do you know, had he heard about the school being hit? How long did he have to wait to know the two of you were okay?
1945.
So he had a long period of time where he did not know how his family was doing.
Right.
That had to have been so hard.
It was just as hard for him as it was for us.
So he was clinging to hope. And for your mom, she knew, and it had to have been so hard for her because she would have wanted, we're so used to now texting and automatic news that it's hard to appreciate when you're waiting for a letter and the letter's being stopped. There's no communication going on.
But it was funny, they just started delivering mail by air, but the paper had to be so thin, it couldn't weigh very much, so it was hard to read some of those letters on that thin paper.
Okay.
Yeah, that was before airmail.
Right. Well, resources were limited, and then the Germans were reading everything that came through, which would have slowed mail down even more, correct?
At the beginning, yes, but then after the war, of course, the Germans had nothing to do with the letters that came after the war.
Okay. And I know there was another incident that happened that impacted your household. I think you said broke your windows. What was that situation?
Well, that was, there was going to be a big celebration for Hitler's birthday, and a lot of the high-ranking German officers came to town. But one thing that happened they hadn't planned on, there was a freighter that the Germans had restored, and they were furnishing it with lots of dynamite, caps, and fuses. And they had in mind if they were going to Kirkenes, which is a town in the northern part of Norway, and it borders Russia. They thought if they had to make a fast getaway there, they would have the ship in the harbor and it would blow up and they would get on their way. But that never happened. The ship continued sailing around the coast, and under darkness they would load more dynamite and fuses on the ship. And eventually it ended up in Bergen Harbor, which is very close to where we lived. And one of the men, they were working on this ship, and a fire started, and before long the fire reached where all the explosives were held, and it has a terrific explosion. We lived quite a ways away from there, but we felt it and our windows broke, but there was so much damage, and hundreds of Norwegians were killed and about 5,000 were injured, and many of them lost their sight because of all the blowing glass at that time. And that all happened, that was in 1944, and the school bombing was in 1944, so that was a bad year, the worst year of the war.
Okay. So to say that Norway was impacted, it was significantly impacted.
Absolutely.
And your little town was significantly impacted because that is where the submarine station was set up.
That's right.
You know, so it was under direct assault.
Yeah.
You know, so you were looking at limited resources, a loaf of bread for a family of 5, made out of sawdust, so not even a peeling bread. And yet, through it all, it sounds like your family really still maintained a level of joy in the midst of the storm. How did you do that?
Well, we had a lot of friends. In fact, my best friend, her her actual name was Olga, but she was called Musa, so we were Musa and Dussi. And she just died last year, so we have kept in touch all these years. So her kids keep me informed on how she was doing, because she also had cancer.
Okay.
And
you said also because you yourself have been battling cancer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So.
But her husband and her and I, we all went to school together. So we had lots of friends. But some of them were killed just by the bombings.
Okay.
You know, their house being bombed or whatever.
All lives were touched. In fact, you and I were talking about that just as with cancer, there's probably not a person watching this who hasn't been impacted in some way by cancer. So too with the war.
Right.
So then finally, there's the triumphant announcement. The war is over. You get to either have Dad come to Norway or you can go to America. What happened?
That's right. That was in May of 1945. The war was over in Norway. And then a few months had gone by, and my parents hadn't decided whether my dad should come to Norway or if we should go back to the United States. But then my dad said that it was best if we came back to the United States because Norway was so devastated after the war. So once that decision was made, my mom got busy to make arrangements for us to come back to the States. The only sad part, her dad was very sick at that time, but she felt that her sister and brother would be there to take care of him. But as it turned out, He died the same day that we left Bergen.
Oh, and you did not know as you were leaving, or you did know as you were leaving?
We did know. You know, but the plans were made, and my mom wanted to get back, you know,
Oh,
to
it
see
had
my
been
dad.
6 years of separation.
She had her brother and sister there to take care of her dad. They didn't expect him to die the night we left, but he did.
Oh.
There was a letter addressed to Karen and I that we could have come back sooner, but because it was a very dangerous trip at that time, my mom wouldn't let us go by ourselves because she wasn't allowed to come. She wasn't a citizen at that time, but Karen and I were American citizens.
So, great excitement to return home, but great sadness over the death of her father. And on that note, again, this is a story of overcoming, because you did overcome great odds. There was tragedy experienced by all, to be sure. But I want to end on that note of the anticipation of arriving home and seeing your dad for the first time after 6 years. So there will be a part 2 to this. We'd love for you to join us. And for more information, feel free to contact Catherine Hoff Mount. And the number is listed as 248-620
4147.
4147. But do look for part 2 in this Overcoming a Story of Hope. Thank you for joining us.
The views expressed in this show are for general educational purposes only and do not constitute professional advice on any subject matter, nor do they necessarily reflect the views or opinions of its guests or of Independence Television. If mental health assistance is needed, please seek professional licensed treatment.